Hello again, everybody. Welcome to the third iteration of the best builds in Baldur's Gate 3. This time around, I have what I think is the best spellcaster in the game in the Sorlock. Although, as you'll see, it's more of a Sor Fighter roguelock, but we call it a Sorlock because the main function of the build is leveraging your Sorcerer metamagic to cast as many Warlock Eldritch Blasts as possible per turn. This build could very well be the poster child of Baldur's Gate 3 builds. It probably has the best pure single target damage in the game, but because Eldritch Blast is shot in raise, it's simultaneously got excellent cleave and AoE damage as well. It's a charisma based caster, so it makes a great phase character, but these aren't even the only reasons this build is so strong. These are just formalities. Later on in the video, I'll showcase how this build can make enemies outright skip their turn by literally dealing damage to them, how you get your crit range so low that you crit on just about every other beam of Eldritch Blast, how it can chain what feels like an infinite number of blasts, how force damage is the least resisted damage type in the game by enemies, and all of this, all these merits, these strengths, these advantages, they come from a cantrip. Imagine that all the clips you saw in the showcase are brought to you by a spell that is in the same category as Sacred Flame, Firebolt, and Ray of Frost. In essence, that is what makes Sorlock so unbelievably strong. It's the best spellcaster in the game that doesn't even use spell slots. Granted, you will be using spell slots to generate sorcery points to cast more Eldritch Blast, but the core damage of the build comes from an infinite resource. In a way, you could say that the Sorlock combines the resource advantage of martial classes with the general range advantage of spellcasters. With all that being said, there are a ton of ways to build a Sorlock, so much so that I couldn't even decide on just one for this video. So I'm going to be showing my two alternatives to building a Sorlock, but of course there's always going to be more ways to build it that depend on a bunch of personal variables. But anyway, let's get into the builds. At this point, it's definitely become a trope on this channel, but I'm contractually obligated to start this section by saying Astarion Ex Machina. I know. Look, take it up with Larian, okay? His happy buff is just way too strong, not to mention for any build that cares about making attack rolls, which just so happens to be practically every build. But I will say that his Ascension bonus is not relevant to this build, as his 1d10 necrotic damage isn't applied to spells, since they're not a form of weapon damage. So I'm happy to report that for once, Astarion isn't the obvious pick for my build guides. In terms of choices for custom races, Wood Elf remains incredibly strong for their mobility. Of course, as always, we have the Halfling to mitigate the amount of critical misses both in and out of combat, Dwergar for invisibility, Dragonborn for absolutely nothing, the usual suspects. But especially because we absolutely need shield proficiency, which we don't get from Warlock or Sorcerer, which will be the only classes in our build until the latter portions of Act 2, I think the best pick with the highest immediate in-game impact is the Wood Half-Elf. Now, the human also gets shield proficiency, but the half-elf is just better in every conceivable way. If you choose a race that doesn't have shield proficiency and equip a shield, it'll prevent you from casting spells, which we don't want. In essence, it'll prevent you from a +2 bonus to your armor class in exchange for some useless weapon or dual wield which we'll never use. Ideally, until the very end of the game, we want to have a staff and a shield. The point being that because we don't get shield proficiency from our multi-class until way later, we need to get it from our race.
We interrupt this program for an important news announcement.
I have to make a quick but important note about choosing the Dark Urge while running this build. Of course, I'll always advocate for picking the Urge if for nothing but the cape. However, the single most important piece of gear for this build is the Potent Robe. We get the Potent Robe from Alfira by saving the Tieflings in Moonrise Towers in Act 2. When playing the Dark Urge, there's a scripted event in Act 1 that forces you to kill Alfira and therefore locks you out of the Potent Robe. You could get around this by knocking Alfira out right before the long rest where you would otherwise be scripted to kill her, forcing you to kill Quill, the Dragonborn Bard, instead. That would be the only way in which you could play the Dark Urge and get the Potent Robe without modding or cheating it in. I've personally never been able to get this to work. It's almost like the game knows that I've knocked Alfira out and refuses to give me the camp scene. And of course, since you cannot save and load in honor mode, if you make any mistakes or forget to knock Alfira out before it happens, you're just screwed. So please proceed with caution and choose the Dark Urge at your own discretion. And before you ask, yes, it kinda is the end of the world for the Sorlock if you cannot get the Potent Robes. This build is unique in terms of leveling progression for two main reasons. One, since the Sorlock is a spellcaster, we're in no rush to hit level 5 with any single one of our classes because we don't get an extra attack at level 5. Two, our final build will be split between so many classes that we're faced with the difficult question of when do we introduce each of those classes. First of all, what are each of those classes? To help guide you in making decisions regarding leveling curve, it's important to have a clear picture of what the build will look like at level 12. I'll build two variations of the Sorlock in this video. The first variation contains the following level breakdown: 4 Sorcerer, 2 Warlock, 3 Rogue, and 3 Fighter. And the second variation is virtually the same except we allocate the Fighter levels into Sorcerer and Rogue. So, do we start Sorc, then take Warlock, then Sorc again? Do we start Fighter for heavy armor, and then Sorc, and then Warlock, and then Rogue? Despite the curious premise, the answer is actually quite simple. One concept remains true regardless of build in Baldur's Gate 3. The lower your overall level, the weaker multiclassing will be. Multiclassing works effectively when you can introduce the capstone levels of the classes you want into your build. Otherwise, having something like 2 Sorc, 1 Warlock, 1 Fighter at total level 4 won't achieve anything. It's also important to consider that although we don't have to think about delaying an extra attack, multiclassing does delay getting feats, which are also extremely important power spikes, especially in the early game. Taking all these variables into account, I think our best course of action, regardless of which variation we're building, is to start Warlock and level it all the way until level 5. That way we have our Eldritch Blast immediately, don't delay our first feat, as well as make use of other great benefits of the Warlock class such as Hunger of Hadar, which is legitimately one of the best control spells in the game. Then at level 6, we can respec to start with Sorc and take a 4 Sorc 2 Warlock split. That way, by the time we first start multiclassing, we have access to our first feat, Eldritch Blast, and Sorcerer meta magic. So let's finally get into making the build. We take our first level into Warlock and are immediately greeted with the foundation of the build in our Eldritch Blast. For your second cantrip, the choice is entirely up to you and will depend on what other builds in your party can do. Something with utility like Friends or Mage Hand is always useful. For our subclass, although we'll choose the Great Old One by the end of the build, the Fiend is a better choice until we respec due to the survivability of the Dark One's Blessing and the versatility of your Fiend summon. Shovel stands out as one of the best summons as he has invisibility as a cantrip and can always start combats with Surprise. You guys know what Surprise is useful for? You read my mind, the Gloomstalker Assassin. Check out the guide. For our spells, Hex is a must to weaponize our bonus action, but you can choose between Armor of Agathis and Hellish Rebuke for your second choice. For our background, I highly recommend Guild Artisan for proficiency in Persuasion and Insight. Both are extremely useful dialogue-based skills, and since the Sorlock is a charisma-based caster, it has the most efficacy in dialogue and as a face character. For our ability points, we'll put our +2 bonus into Charisma and our +1 bonus into Dexterity. 16 Dexterity, 16 Charisma, 17 if you plan on giving this character the Hag's Hair. Usually it doesn't matter all too much who you give the Hag's Hair, but the Sorlock really benefits from getting the Hag's Hair, as it'll mean we can get our Charisma to 20 with 1 feat, which can actually influence our gearing in Act 3. The remaining points will be 14 in Constitution, and either 10 in Wisdom or Intelligence. The choice is yours. At level 2, we get access to another spell. Pick whichever spell you hadn't picked before between Armor of Agathis and Hellish Rebuke. We also get our first Eldritch Invocations, really the only 2 you'll ever need, and also the only reason we need to take at least 2 levels of Warlock in the final build to get these invocations are Agonizing Blast and Repelling Blast. Agonizing Blast will make your blasts deal extra damage equal to your Charisma modifier, which at this point in the game is +3, and Repelling Blast Remember to put Repelling Blast onto your hotbar to exercise agency over when you push enemies back and when you don't. It may seem strange, like why would I ever want to turn it off? For many reasons actually. There will be times where pushing an enemy back will push them out of range for your melee characters, or more importantly, push them to a place where you can no longer loot their body. I've once pushed near into the vat of lava next to the dig site and just cooked that portion of my campaign. Just remember to put it on your hotbar so that you at least have the choice to turn it off if you see something wrong with the push trajectory. At level 3, we get access to level 2 spells. Although there are a few interesting options, really the only action you should be taking even this early on is just using Eldritch Blast. So you can pick according to what brings the most unique value to your team composition. Otherwise, something like Misty Step is always great for mobility. We also get a Pact boon, and we'll choose the Pact of the Chain, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to summon the Quasit, which can perpetually be invisible and therefore start combat with surprise. At level 4, we get some more cantrips and spells, but again, most all of your actions will be spent on Eldritch Blast, so the choices here are relatively inconsequential. More importantly, we get access to our first feat. Now, this build will ever only use one or two of the following 3 feats: Ability Improvement, Alert, or Spell Sniper. No other feat really grants us anything that has more synergy than any of those feats. An Ability Improvement is generally a good feat and acts as a good benchmark feat for strength, but it's especially strong with the Sorlock since our Eldritch Blast scale with Charisma, so taking an Ability Improvement is akin to scaling your damage. Alert and Spell Sniper have better uses later on when we can afford to spend our feat on something other than just getting our Charisma as high as possible. So for now, we're just going to take an Ability Improvement and put both points into Charisma. At level 5, we get access to way better spells, and some that are even worth considering casting over Eldritch Blast, especially this early on in the game. A non-negotiable pick is Hunger of Hadar. I know I've already mentioned this, but it's easily one of the best control spells in the game. Enemies inside it are blinded, slowed, and take damage over time, and your allies outside it have advantage on all attack rolls made on enemies inside it. Couple that with the fact that you can use your Repelling Blast invocation to shoot enemies back inside the Hunger of Hadar, and you can create some absolutely unbelievable choke points that shut down enemy turns completely. It's so good that I recommended taking it as a magical secret in my Bardidim video, and even contemplated building a Sorlock with 5 levels in Warlock just for Hunger of Hadar. After taking Hunger of Hadar, you may even be tempted to replace an earlier spell pick with something like Fireball or Counterspell. Since Warlock doesn't have conventional spell slot progression, it may even be the correct choice, as upscaling most of the level 2 spells don't actually do anything. You also get another Eldritch Invocation. One option is to take Devil's Sight to be able to see in darkness, such that if you take the darkness spell and cast it on yourself, you can create sort of a domain where you have advantage on attack rolls and enemies have disadvantage. At level 6, we do a complete respec of our build. We want to do multiple things: incorporate Sorcerer into our build for meta magic, get rid of all but 2 levels of Warlock, start Sorcerer for proficiency in Constitution saving throws, and maintain our ability improvement feat for Charisma. We only do this now because level 6 allows us to do all of those things at once. So we head to Withers, ask him to change our class, and start anew from Sorcerer. At Sorcerer level 1, there are a bunch of tedious and minor choices to make that will end up just clogging your action bar. As a rule of thumb going forward, know that you should pick whatever you want for spells, and that I'll only give strong recommendations rather than build-defining must-haves. Not because we aren't offered strong spells, but because we should be spending our actions, bonus actions, and spell slots by way of sorcery point conversions on casting Eldritch Blast instead of spells costing actual spell slots. I can count on one hand the number of times this build cast a spell that wasn't Eldritch Blast in the entire campaign I collected clips from. Really, what you should be considering when picking spells or cantrips is, what can this selection do that Eldritch Blast can't do that I would need it to do. I'll let you know now, spoiler alert, there isn't a lot Eldritch Blast can't do. So getting into some of the strong recommendations, for cantrips I've selected Friends for dialogue, Shocking Grasp as a melee option, Ray of Frost literally to put out fire, and Mage Hand for environmental, guidance, and traversal. For spells, I recommend Shield as a defensive reaction, and Magic Missiles in case I need to deal minor damage with guaranteed accuracy. Mage Armor is another strong pick, but I usually have tons of scrolls of Mage Armor, so I don't feel the need to prepare it. For subclass, we choose the Draconic Bloodline as it provides the best defense and survivability for what's otherwise a pretty squishy build with low AC. There used to be an interaction between choosing Lightning Ancestry and the damage you deal with the Spellsparkler staff, but that's since been patched, I believe, so your Dragon Ancestry doesn't matter all too much. We don't deal any of these damage types, so we don't care to empower them. We only care to gain resistance to them. Of these choices, the most common damage type that enemies deal is probably fire. Our background remains the same, as do our ability points. Sorcerer level 2, we get another spell we won't be using over Eldritch Blast. Just go with a ritual spell like Featherfall or Enhanced Leap. We do, however, get our first meta magic abilities. Still not the one we actually want, which is Quicken Spell, but Twin Spell can be great to twin cast abilities like Haste or the Draconic Weapon enchantment from the Drakethroat Glaive, and Distance Spell can help close the distance if an enemy is out of range of your blast. Are you guys getting the points with the spells? But to be fair, Enhance Ability is really good for dialogue checks. In other news, we get the meta magic ability we will be using the most in Quicken Spell. Spells that cost an action cost a bonus action instead, or in other words, you get 2 casts of Eldritch Blast per turn. Once you unlock this, the build will become super one-dimensional. Spend all your spell slots on Sorcery Points, spend all your Sorcery Points on Quicken Spell, and spend all your actions on Eldritch Blast. How's your day going? You know, I hope everything's going well. Summer's just around the corner, you know, there's that to look for. For our feat, we'll choose what we chose before in an ability improvement to upgrade our charisma by 2 points. Now that we've gotten our feat and Quicken Spell, we need to introduce the 2 levels of Warlock for Eldritch Blast and the Eldritch Invocations. At Warlock level 1, you can pick the same spells and cantrips, of course remembering to take Eldritch Blast. This time, however, instead of picking the Fiend for our subclass, we're going to be picking the Great Old One. We do this because we're going to be crit fishing with this build from this point onwards, so not only are we constantly proccing Mortal Reminder, but we'll be weighing gear pieces that make it so enemies will have to skip their turn outright if they fail the saving throw on our critical hits, but I'll get into that in the gearing section. Warlock 2 follows the same rules as before, taking whichever spell you didn't take previously, and Agonizing Blast and Repelling Blast for your invocations. Now, although we've gotten all that we want from Sorcerer and Warlock, taking either Rogue or Fighter here would be a mistake, because we don't get anything useful from those dips until their respective subclasses. What I mean is, let's say we add Rogue right now. Sneak Attack Melee and Sneak Attack Ranged aren't useful additions, whereas if I keep taking Sorcerer, it'll at least grant us more spell slots that we can turn into Sorcery Points. It's quite min-maxy to do this, as it'll mean having to respec again at level 9 to take 4 Sorcerer, 2 Warlock, and then 3 Rogue, but I'm assuming metagaming is what you guys are watching this video for, so we take our 5th level into Sorcerer at total level 7. Level 3 spells are actually pretty good, and Haste stands out as one of the strongest contenders since we can twin cast it, giving us 2 hastes for the price of 1. Operating on the same logic as the last level, we'll take another level into Sorcerer for more sorcery points instead of starting a dip into one of our multi-classes. After Haste, Counterspell, Lightning Bolt, and Firebolt stand out as some of the stronger options. Now that we're level 9 and can add 4 Sorcerer, 2 Warlock, and 3 Rogue into our build all at once, we're going to respec again, swapping the last 2 levels of Sorcerer out for Rogue, and taking the Rogue subclass Thief at this level, total level 9. Everything up until level 6 in terms of decisions will be the same, so I'll fast forward the respec process and explain everything from the moment we add Rogue onwards. So now at total level 7, we take the next 3 levels into Rogue. There are no decisions to make in the first 3 levels of Rogue, so I'll just see you guys at level 9 when I'm talking about the subclass. Now at total level 9, we finally have our Rogue subclass, which will be Thief Rogue. The reasoning is beautifully simple. Thief grants us another bonus action, which will mean another quicken spell per turn, which will mean another Eldritch Blast per turn. With Haste, now you can cast 4 Eldritch Blasts that shoot 2 beams each, 5 blasts if you get a kill while on the Bloodlust Elixir. By level 9, you also have the Potent Robe, so for all intents and purposes, this is an extremely significant power spike for this build. Level 10 is when you make a decision regarding which variation you want to build. A reminder that the first variation will involve adding Fighter into the build from this point onwards, and the second variation entails a final level into Rogue for a feat and 2 more levels into Sorcerer. So what is the difference? It's basically a matter of resource availability and damage output. The first variation has less total spell slots to convert into sorcery points, but will deal more short-term damage because of Action Surge. The second variation has slightly more spell slots to spend on sorcery points, but is obviously missing the Action Surge edge in terms of 1-turn Nova damage potential. Some factors to consider are the resource management of the rest of your team. If your team is inclined to long rest frequently, then it's probably better to use the first variant, as you'll get more action surges and replenish more spell slots. Whereas if you have a party that can sustain itself on little to no long rests and are interested in maintaining crucial buffs, then it could be worth considering the second variation to have a few more quicken spells in between long rests. Regardless of your choice, both are extremely strong and viable, which is why I've decided to include both. In the first variation, we take our first level of fighter at level 10. The only relevant fighting style will only ever be defense, and even then we will only situationally wear armor depending on what gear setup we choose. Our second level of fighter at level 11, granting us access to Action Surge, which will mean an additional Eldritch Blast per turn, twice per long rest. And our final level 12 will be fighter again for the champion subclass. Not only do the other subclasses just have no synergy with the Sorlock, but the champion subclass pointedly reduces our critical hit range by 1, which is applied to all 3 beams of Eldritch Blast. That is part of the reason we're going to invest so heavily into critical hit damage and reduction, because an attack roll is made for each beam of Eldritch Blast, which will also mean that we can critical hit up to 3 times in one action. Pair that with the critical hit damage riders of our gear pieces, and the champion subclass is perfectly fitting and makes a lot of sense. In the second variation, our 10th level will be spent on a 4th level into Rogue to get another feat. Again, we're faced with one of the same 3 choices as before. This is how you should weigh your options. If you did not give this character the Hag's Hair, and it therefore only has 18 charisma at this point, take an ability improvement and set your charisma to 20. If you have given this character the Hag's Hair, and therefore it has 20 charisma, between Alert and Spell Sniper, I would choose Spell Sniper. It'll reduce our critical hit range with spells by 1, and essentially give us the champion subclass benefit from the first variation without having to take fighter levels for it. And now to round out the second variation, we take the same 5th and 6th levels into Sorcerer as we did preceding the Rogue levels earlier on in the video. As is always the case in my build guides, Illithid Powers are entirely supplementary and are by no means a necessity to the function of the build, but as is also always the case in my build guides, they're great supplements that will inevitably help grease the cogs of the build's engine. Let's get the frequent customers out of the way. Always take Favorable Beginnings, Luck of the Far Realms, Psionic Backlash, and Call the Weak on as many party members as possible. Between the increased accuracy, guaranteed critical hits, weaponized reactions, and execute mechanics, there's never a reason not to take these abilities on as many characters as possible. They work for every build and make not just the build, but your team stronger as a result of having them. Beyond the obvious choices, an Illithid power I would have never imagined taking, nevertheless getting value from, is Displace. But Displace is surprisingly good for the Sorlock. The reason it's effective is because you're so easily able to incur fall damage on your enemies with Repelling Blast. It's especially helpful because it incentivizes pushing enemies off of smaller ledges to where you can still loot their bodies afterwards, but also deal more damage to them than just the fall damage would have. I found that by the end of my campaign with this build, Displace had actually accumulated a pretty significant amount of damage. Partial Illithid is pretty meh for this build. I'll always vouch for doing it because of Psionic Dominance and Fly. Like if Psionic Dominance and Fly were all that were offered from becoming partial Illithid, I'd still do it. But other than that, there aren't really any Outring abilities that stand out as particularly synergistic with this build. Like you'd think Free Cast with a Spellcaster, but our damage comes from a cantrip, so it's not even good for that. If you're on PC like me, just go partial Illithid and install a mod to get rid of the visuals. You'll be happy to hear that there isn't some optimal balance of how many spell slots you should convert into sorcery points. Just turn all your spell slots into sorcery points immediately, especially by Act 2. Because of the way we've built and geared our character, there isn't a spell that you can cast that'll be better than your Eldritch Blasts. With that in mind, pretty early on into playing this build, you're gonna recognize a pretty serious problem. Damn, I don't have that many sorcery points per long rest, and god damn, Quicken Spell costs a lot of sorcery points. Even with the second variation of the build, you're constantly hovering below 30 sorcery points per long rest, which will mean that you can Quicken Spell less than 10 times per long rest, and that's obviously assuming that you do turn all your spell slots into sorcery points and don't spend them on something else. So how do we combat this? We want more spell slots because we want more sorcery points because we want more Eldritch Blasts. But we don't want to have to be so stingy and conservative with our Quicken spells. We want to be able to use it at all times for every combat. Of course, the obvious answer is just constantly long resting, but sometimes long resting's just, it's not in the cards. In that case, there are two main solutions. One of which is kind of cheesy, and the other of which is expensive. I mean, look, I didn't say it'd be practical or fair, I just said that I had two solutions. The first solution to getting more spell slots or sorcery points without long resting is using the Shield of Devotion that you can buy from Quartermaster Tali at Last Light Inn. It reads that you gain one level 1 spell slot after equipping it, and it's only once per long rest, but if you turn the spell slot it gives you into a sorcery point, I guess it doesn't register as you having consumed the spell slot. So if you then unequip the shield and equip it again, it'll give you a spell slot again and again and again and again times infinity. It's a super tedious process, which serves me right for doing something so obviously unintentional. But to speed the process up, you can put the shield onto your hotbar, equip it, turn the spell slot into a sorcery point, unequip it by clicking on it on your hotbar, equip it again by clicking on it on your hotbar, turn the spell slot into a sorcery point, and rinse and repeat the process until you have the desired amount of sorcery points. Okay, let's move on to the second solution before Larian banishes me to Avernus. The second solution, which seems so much more innocent now in contrast, is just to stock up on potions of Angelic Reprieve sold by various vendors in the game to refresh all of your first and second level spell slots to then turn them into sorcery points. To my knowledge, Land Tarb and Moonrise Towers is the earliest source of consistent potions you can buy, so as soon as you reach him, go to him, buy out his inventory of potions, reset his inventory by progressing any character in your party by 1 level, buy out his inventory of potions again, rinse and repeat. If at any point you're fully leveled, just switch to a character that isn't in your party, or go respec with Withers solely to refresh Lantar's inventory. The long-awaited gearing section. If you're new to my videos, the way I do this section is by having what I think is the best combination of available gear equipped on my character with viable alternatives in my inventory that you can use either until or instead of the gear on my character. We're off to a rough start in Act 1. Other than the staff, the gloves, and maybe the boots, none of the gear pieces in Act 1 are specifically tailored to our build, in the same way they could be and are for the likes of the Bardadin or the Gloomstalker. Our lack of armor proficiency really hurts, and gearing in Act 1 literally just becomes like a potent robe waiting room where we put together the best that we can until we do much better in Act 2 and spike really hard in Act 3. Regardless, let's get into some of my suggestions. For our helmet, we have the Lifebringer sold by Blurg in the Myconid colony. It's a tiny but nice bit of healing that synergizes passively with our staff. For our chest piece, we have the Protectee Sparks Wall that you can loot from the end of that long hallway with booby traps in Grimforge. Again, it synergizes passively with our staff. We will have lightning charges most of the time, so this piece will reliably give us +1 to our armor class and our saving throws. For our gloves, we finally have something to be excited about in the Daredevil gloves sold by the Gith vendor inside Kreshulek. It gives us a +1 to our spell attack rolls, as well as a toggleable feature that allows us to cast Eldritch Blast, or any spell for that matter, as a melee attack, which is especially strong in the early game, where what would have otherwise been an attack roll penalty is the most significant. For our boots, we have the Boots of Stormy Clamor sold by Omelum at the Myconid colony. These are half of the reason we can make enemies skip their turns just by attacking them. The other half will appear in Act 2. Until then, these are just a great way to stack reverberation on enemies. For our weapon, we have a non-negotiable pick in the Spell Sparkler. It's offered as a choice in the quest reward for saving Counselor Floric in Joaquin's Rest. Not only is it the best item of the 3 choices regardless, but it's also quite simply the best weapon in the game for this build until we reach Act 3. The lightning charges help with accuracy, are applied to each beam of Eldritch Blast, and provide by far the most significant increase to our damage output of all other staves and daggers in Act 1 and 2 combined. There's nothing to think about. Just equip the staff and deal more damage as a result. For our shield, I have the Adamantine shield that you can craft after defeating Grim in Grimforge. It's easily the best shield in Act 1 if for nothing but the attackers can't land critical hits on the wearer tag. It'll decrease the amount of damage we're projected to take by a lot. For our necklace, I have the Amulet of Misty Step, which you can get from inside Priestess Guts room. It's just a free Misty Step per short rest, there's nothing much else to it. For our rings, I have the Whispering Promise sold by Volo and the Ring of Protection, which is a quest reward for successfully stealing the Idol of Sylvanas and handing it to Mole. The Whispering Promise is a Bless on Heal, which technically means that you are able to cast Bless as a bonus action by drinking a healing pot. The Ring of Protection is purely for armor class, as this build is pretty squishy overall. For ranged weapons, I just suggest picking up 2 hand crossbows so that you have something to do with your bonus action before you get access to Quicken spell. Even though we're not proficient with them, some damage is better than no damage. In terms of alternatives, we have the Circlet of Psionic Revenge from inside a chest in the Inquisitor's room in the Kresh. It comes with a nice retaliation mechanic and is even more useful if you're a Githyanki. You could also disguise self as Githyanki for the effect. The Spider Silk armor just represents any light armor you can get your hands on for higher AC, of which the light armors in Act 1 are all pretty bad. I wish you could craft light armor in Grimforge. That would help this build in Act 1 a lot. For our gloves, we have the Gloves of Missile Snaring that you can buy from Aaron in the Druid's Grove. or the Gloves of Dexterity that you can buy from the Gith vendor in the Creche. For our boots, we have the Disintegrating Nightwalkers that you can pick up off of Nier in the Grimforge. For a necklace, you could wear the Silver Pendant, which you get from the hill where the Spider's Nest is, near the Druid's Grove, if you don't have a Cleric or a source of guidance in the party. Finally, if you've decided not to craft a shield in Grimforge, fret not. Feel free to just equip any old shield you find in Act 1. The critical hit tag is nice, but the most important thing is the bonus to your armor class. The choices are a lot more streamlined this time around because there are already a few build-defining pieces in this act. Let's get into it. For our helmet, we have the Fistbreaker helm sold by Lantarv in Moonrise Towers for a +1 to our spell save DC and initiative rolls. For our cloak, we have the Thunderskin cloak sold by the Drow Blood Merchant Araj in Moonrise Towers. We'll be responsible for much of the reverberation application on enemies, so this cloak should proc quite often. For our chest piece, we have the Potent Robe. This might as well be called the Sorlock Robe or the Potent Eldritch Blast. This is a quest reward from Althera at Last Light Inn if you manage to save the Tieflings from Moonrise Tower's prison. The Gregarious Caster tag is literally just the Agonizing Blast effect of adding your Charisma modifier to your Eldritch Blast damage, but it stacks with Agonizing Blast, so it adds the modifier twice to each beam of Eldritch Blast. Unless you gave this character the Hag's Hair, you should have 18 Charisma, which will mean a +4 modifier added twice, so +8 damage to each beam of Eldritch Blast. There is a Sharan Shrine in the middle of the portion of the map that Moonrise Towers is in that will grant you a +5 bonus to your Charisma if you pass the Charisma check, which will then mean a +10 damage modifier to your Eldritch Blasts until your next long rest. Then in Act 3, you have the Mirror of Loss for your Charisma, the Birthright Helm. I could go on forever about how insane the potent robes are for this build, but just know that this robe is practically the reason this build exists. Our gloves remain the same for lack of a better alternative. Our boots remain the same because of our necklace. Our necklace changes to the Spine Shutter amulet that you loot from the Mimic chest in the upper floors of Moonrise Towers. The Spine Shutter amulet inflicts 2 stacks of reverb every time you inflict damage with a ranged spell attack. So yes, that means each beam of Eldritch Blast, which means that in one cast of Eldritch Blast, you'll inflict 4 stacks of reverb from the amulet, and possibly 2 stacks of reverb from the Boots of Stormy Clamor, which will immediately knock the enemy prone, right? When reverb hits 5 stacks, the enemy goes prone. If you score a critical hit, then we proc Mortal Reminder from the Great Old One subclass, which will then fear the enemy. So what do you need to get out of the prone? And what can't you do when you're frightened? That is the skip turn combination I was alluding to earlier. By inflicting stacks of reverb at an exponential rate and possibly fearing enemies, you can outright make them skip their turn as a result of the interactions between our gear pieces, our subclass, Eldritch Blast, and oh my god, I love this build so much. For our ring, we'll go with the Risky Ring sold by the same Drow Merchant in Moonrise Towers, granting us advantage on all of our attack rolls. For our other ring, we have the Callous Glow Ring from inside the vault near Balthazar in the Sharan Monastery, which will add another 2 points of damage to each beam of Eldritch Blast. Just remember to cast Light on a party member or yourself. As mentioned before, the Spell Sparkler is still the best weapon. We can switch our shield to Kethrix for a +1 to our spell attack rolls. And for our bow, we have the Darkfire Shortbow sold by Damon at Last Light Inn, which comes with some phenomenal passive effects, like giving us a free haste once per long rest, as well as resistance to fire and cold damage. For alternatives, we start with the Covert Cowl that you can loot off of the Mean Locks inside the Last Light Inn attic for the first iteration of crit range reduction. Be warned that because this is considered light armor, it will tank our AC, as we only get the Sorcerer armor class benefit when we're not wearing a gear piece with an armor tag. If you plan on giving the Risky Ring to another party member, it may be worth buying the Marksmanship Hat from Roa Moonglow and Moonrise Towers to help out with attack rolls. For capes, you could also go with the Cloak of Protection sold by Quartermaster Tali at Last Light Inn, or the Flesh Melter Cloak from that one dungeon area with all the zombies in it near the Road to Baldur's Gate waypoint. Until you get Kethrix Shield, I love using the Sentinel Shield that you can buy from Lantarv and Moonrise Towers. for a huge +3 bonus to your initiative. A +3 bonus to initiative with 16 dexterity is almost guaranteed to make you go somewhere in the first 3 to 5 turns. Of course, the Shield of Devotion from Quartermaster Tali for the spell slot exploit. Again, if you've given another party member the Risky Ring, you can replace it with either the Coruscation Ring from the Last Light Inn Attic or the Killer Sweetheart from the self-same Sharon Trial. Finally, you could go with the Evasive Shoes sold by Mattis at Last Light Inn, but for the reverberation strategy I mentioned earlier, I highly recommend keeping the Boots of Stormy Clamor on this character. If you guys have seen any of my other build guides, you know that I usually preface the Act 3 suggestions by saying that there are many permutations of gear combinations that I cannot account for, and therefore I don't go on record as to say that this combination I'm wearing is the best one. But you know what, guys? My third video, this time, it won't be any different. Of course, there can be better setups by the end of the game that you might know or that you might see that I don't know or I can't see. But all jokes aside, I actually do feel very confident in my selections this time, hence why I hardly have any alternatives. Perhaps I can hide behind the excuse that these selections work best for the way I built the Sorlock in this video, but enough disclaimers, let's get into the gear. For our helmet, we have the Birthright sold at Sorcerer Sundries in the lower city, and if you have 18 or 20 charisma, this is probably the right choice as it adds anywhere from 2 to 4 damage per beam of Eldritch Blast. But if, like me, you gave this character the Hag's Hair and succeeded in giving it a charisma bonus from the Mirror of Loss, and therefore have 23 charisma without Birthright, it's undoubtedly the correct choice to go for the Helmet of Grit. You get the Helmet of Grit from the Cursed Girl's body in Kazdor's Palace. It grants you an additional bonus action when you're below 50% health points. To be honest, it might be correct to wear the Helmet of Grit irrespective of your charisma. Incremental damage increases can never compete with an entire additional cast of Eldritch Blast. However, the risk becomes that in order to be able to cast an additional Eldritch Blast with the Helm of Grit, you need to hover below 50% health with 15 AC. It shouldn't be a problem, but if you're playing Honor mode, it may be best not to risk it. Like, the build does outrageous damage regardless. Our cloak is the Cloak of the Weave, sold by Hellsick in the Devil's Fee. A +1 to our spell attack rolls from a cape slot is actually pretty good. The Potent Robes remain, of course. For our gloves, we'll go with the Crater Flesh gloves, sold by the Ballis Merchant after becoming an unholy assassin at the Murder Tribunal. Shout out to this commenter for letting me know that the Crater Flesh gloves are one of the only remaining damage rider sources in Honor mode, meaning that the 1d6 damage of the Crater Flesh gloves can be applied multiple times within one critical beam of Eldritch Blast. DRS can be a confusing concept to grasp, but I'm confident that these are by far and away the best gloves for this build, especially considering that right now with this setup, our critical hit range is 17, but it can be 15. Our attack rolls are with advantage, and 3 beams per cast of Eldritch Blast, like, we're critting insanely often. Our boots, rings, and necklaces all remain the same for all of the aforementioned reasons, and for lack of a better upgrade in Act 3 surprisingly. For our bow, we want to equip the Deadshot purely for the reduction to our critical hit range, which will work in tandem with our weapons, potentially the Spell Sniper feat if you've taken it, or the Champion Fighter subclass if you've taken that. For our weapons, it's going to be any combination of the following 3 weapons. Rhapsody, dropped by Kazdor, Bloodthirst, specifically in the offhand, dropped by Orin, or Knife of the Undermountain King from the Gith Vendor and the Kresh all the way back in Act 1. Although wielding the Knife of the Undermountain King and Bloodthirst seems like the obvious choice to further reduce our critical hit range, the Scarlet Remittance buff from Rhapsody is applied to each beam of Eldritch Blast. That means that at its max stacks of 3, each cast of Eldritch Blast will do an additional 9 damage from just Rhapsody alone. It may not seem like much, but you have to consider the value it accrues over every cast versus the value you lose out on when wielding the other daggers and not critically hitting. Either way, there isn't a wrong choice regarding which 2 of these 3 weapons you decide to use. Finally, if you have a guilty conscience about becoming an unholy assassin, you can choose to grab the Spellmight gloves, which are a quest reward from Lucretius, but fuck finding all of Dribble's body parts, so just pickpocket Lucretius and be done with it.